Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace again. I will make this really short. This is just this last few comments. I was noting that you end up with a few people kind of parading the streets in places like Florence, Italy, where flagellants, people who are whipping themselves to kind of demonstrate the significant sin that they have done in order to earn the plague. So people respond in all kinds of ways. There is just a variety of different responses. And, one key question that we could, ask and maybe infer a little bit is, how could the plague actually lead to the Renaissance? There's a lot of historians who do make the suggestion that the plague was one of the reasons that does kick off humanism, and it leads to some of the artistic endeavors and things like that in the Renaissance. And, why would that be? And there's probably a few different reasons. Certainly, some people during the plague might be kind of questioning the authority of the church, or maybe looking at the relationship, between kind of defined figures and humans, and, questioning some of that. That's quite possible. There's also a kind of an economic reason in that the short-term consequences of the plague are, of course, horrific. Millions of people have lost their lives. There's also a great deal of production that just stops because, villages completely shut down, and there's a great deal of abandonment of farms and things like that. So food doesn't get produced and things don't get made. There's a lot of, things in that first 50 years or so between the 1350s into 1400 where society is essentially recovering from this really, really horrific disaster. But in the time period following that, with many, with fewer people, there's just a lot more resources to go around. And for workers, for example, wages are much higher when there's just fewer workers. Workers can be a lot more demanding. So in order for people to get hired help, they would have to pay them really well. And so the survivors of the plague end up benefiting. In fact, some historians think that one of the reasons why Europe got particularly hit hard by the bubonic plague, it does seem like it happens in other places in the world, but that Europeans, the way in which Europeans fall and succumb to the disease is at a really high rate. And there's questions about why that's the case. Some historians think that at the time the plague hit, European society's kind of carrying capacity was kind of at a max, and you possibly even had famines, and, society was kind of weak, and that was one of the reasons why the plague might have hit so hard. But in the 100 years that are following the plague, there's a great deal more wealth that's kind of created just because there's a little bit of an economic strength. The groups of people who survive become much more economically independent than kind of people before them, and Europe kind of gains from that. So there's perhaps some ways in which the plague, through this long-term wealth that's created, also some psychological reasons, and we get some of this through Petrarch, that people start to look at the Middle Ages as a dark time, and what would have been the darkest of times would be in really most recent memory. In Petrarch's world, he's really not far removed from the plague at all, and so to put that literally behind them and to go to a focus on something that perhaps was a better time, and for Petrarch, that becomes ancient Greece and ancient Rome, just because this Middle Ages seems to be just so reminiscent of the Black Death that would have been so much a part of his life experience. So probably for psychological reasons, economic reasons, a variety of things, people are looking for something new start in the Renaissance, and it becomes kind of a turning point, and the plague might have factored into that. So there are a couple of reasons why Italy, and I'll just note this really fast in terms of, this goes back to Burckhardt's argument about Italy kind of being this magical place where the Renaissance just popped up. And of course, that's not necessarily the case, but we often do look at some of the geographic factors of Italy only because the Renaissance does seem to start there in the time period right after the plague. Why Italy? There is a great deal of urban centers. You have an extensive economic and merchant class, a great deal of attention to banking and financial, all those post-plague economic advantages. And you also have lots and lots of monasteries, different places where individuals from Byzantine or texts from the Islamic Empire made their way, and people are going to be accessing these new texts and paying attention to them and using them, and it becomes kind of new information that helps to inform a society. Of course, you also have just kind of a an imprint of classicism everywhere from the ruins. And then finally, last slide, one other reason why perhaps we might look at Italy kind of uniquely, politically, Italy is not unified under one political system. It has a variety of different city-states. Some of these city-states are republics, but in quite a few of them, you have these leading wealthy families that are competing with each other for power. In the case of Florence, for example, in the years following the plague, the Medici family, the Abruzzi family, these are families that are not formally in power, running as leaders of a particular area because they were chosen, but they're running kind of things from behind the scenes. And this kind of type of family-led influence becomes very, very much the case in Italy. It becomes a big part of what is funding some of the Renaissance projects. A lot of the interest that some of these families have in making their city-states, like Florence, for example, really more attractive, more wealthy, than the other city-states. They try to do this by kind of beautifying some of the areas of the city-state. And in the case of Florence, this comes about by trying to build the largest dome on the cathedral in Florence, and perhaps beautifying some of the buildings and palaces and different types, even things that are social types of buildings, like orphanages, get built, but in such a way that it's going to evoke kind of classical architecture. So there's a great deal of art and architecture that gets funded by families like the Medici family, and these families have huge influence, huge interest in the arts, and they ultimately become kind of the behind-the-scenes reason that a lot of the art and a lot of the architecture gets paid for. So we'll watch a video clip in class about this, but just kind of recognize the Medici family in particular. It will be probably most instrumental in Florence, and that's where our Renaissance conference will take place. Okie doke, guys. I will see you next time. Whoops. That is not what I meant to do. I meant to... Yep, let's turn this off. There's the guy with the cool hat again. Okay, never mind. See you next time.